We all experience some measure of growth through the process of living. And we recognize this growth in that in some way it bestows upon us a more adequate attitude, a more reasonable point of view, or greater courage of decision and determination when need arises. A person said to me not long ago, when I was growing up, I had a very bad temper. But I worked on it quite sincerely, and now my temper is more controllable, and I am less likely to give way to blind impulses or negative attitudes. So, this person concluded, I think I have grown a little through the years. Thus, we think of growing as a progressive process of self-improvement. Sometimes we feel that it is thrust upon us, more or less against our wills. Other times we strenuously attempt to cultivate some sense of increasing ability to cope with circumstances. Growth is a word, however, which applied to the inner life of man is rather abstract, confusing, and it is used very loosely to cover a wide variety of processes which we do not really understand. Perhaps the architect has something to offer in this particular phase of our living. A man designing a house watches day by day the physical structure growing and developing through layer upon layer of stone or masonry, or through the continuous efforts of artisans who by degrees bring the structure to completeness. This process of bringing things to completeness by naturally and inevitably slow procedures sort of reminds us of the idea of building personal character. To the thoughtful person, growth is not a sudden leap toward light. Growth in man as in nature is a slow, regular, continuous, almost imperceptible procedure. Without the assistance of special types of cameras, we cannot watch plants grow. But we do know that if we return several days later and view the plant, we can observe the changes in it, the unfoldment and enlargement of it, and we see that it is filling gradually the archetype of its own kind. Growth is not something we can measure always in terms of moments, but it is something that accumulates, becoming a gradually increasing force for the attainment of some end which we desire or we regard as necessary and proper. Now, when we study man, the question always seems to arise as to what part of man actually grows. We know the physical body develops and reaches maturity, that a growth does take place there. But having once achieved its own maturity, the body continues on a more or less level platform for the greater part of life, and then shows definite signs of decline. The physical person does grow, but it is impossible to conceive this growth as being identical with the development of the person inhabiting this body. To a measure, there seems to be a connection. we know that we have come to expect degrees of physical growth to be associated with consistent degrees of mental development. We do not expect the small child to be an intellectual. We do not expect the small child to grope with problems that are suitable to an adult. We notice, however, that in the course of schooling, the growing child gains certain familiarity with knowledge and gradually comes into the possession of a group of facts which in turn he can use to extend his own insight beyond these facts themselves into their reasonable implications. He has been provided by education with a basic group of elements of knowledge. And by making proper or the best use of these elements, he realizes that he can enrich his life and can gradually gain skill or proficiency in some chosen field. We also know that one kind of growing is more or less completed in the educational process. By the time the person has graduated from high school or college or whatever the case may be, it is assumed that he has received the primary instruments upon which to build or with which to build a mental life. He has been taught with some reservations how to use the various faculties of his own mind. He has learned to solve academic problems. He has learned to unite elements of knowledge to form new levels of knowing. So he starts out reasonably certain that he is well informed. It is not long, however, before he discovers the necessity for another faculty, a faculty that is not based entirely upon textbook knowledge, but which perhaps we may call judgment. Judgment is something that matures more slowly than knowledge in its own proper form. We can amass a great many facts, and having possessed these facts, or having come into an awareness of them, we can go along through the years counting our facts. We can bring them into the forepart of the mind at will. We can use them to interpret other facts or to recognize things similar to those which we have learned. But there comes a time after schooling ends, usually, where the person is forced to face personal judgment, personal responsibility, and to make personal decisions. This seems to require other forms of knowledge. And out of all of the basic schooling that he has gained, there must come a certain overtone, some ability to cope with things not directly learned, but about which learning offers some assistance. As we go along through life, of course, we are inclined to specialize our activities, and as a result of this process, to accumulate more facts in some areas than in others. Because we have more available facts, we are more proficient in these areas. But always there is a dividing line between the workman, we might say, and the executive. The executive is the person who seems to be able to use knowledge more adroitly. The executive seems to have certain capacities and certain skills by means of which his contribution is more dynamic than that of the person who simply has remembered a large area of information. Some fields of activity do not call for much mental executive effort. Others depend heavily on it for the success of enterprise. So looking inside of ourselves and trying to analyze the structure of our own natures, we realize that through the sensory perceptions, as we have already discussed them in the previous talks of this series, and in cooperation with the mental coordinating power, that we do come to certain rather vivid conclusions about things. We are able to arrive at judgments. We are able to go a little beyond what might be termed the body of our facts and become in a measure prophetic. We sense larger meanings, although we may not possess the full understanding of them. We realize that it is possible to continue to apply the knowledge that we accumulate beyond the call of duty. That there are certain duties that we have to perform, but that we can live above and beyond the necessary, moving gradually and resolutely toward more ideal situations or larger uses of knowledge. Growth implies not only the possession of an increasing amount of available insight, but also the factor of experience. And experience is conferred only by active participation in life problems. Growth perhaps comes more directly from the pressure of experience than from any other single cause. It is the emergency which forces man to draw out of himself all available mental resources. As the problems around him intensify, the individual must solve them from himself, or with faculties and powers within himself. If he is in a comparatively secure condition, if his wants are few or his needs are easily met, it follows that for the most part he will not be challenged. And because he is not challenged by circumstances, he does not experience as intensely as those who must face and meet difficult situations. So growth has a great deal to do with the experiencing of the relationship between knowledge and fact. If everything that we learned was absolutely true, and if every situation that arose in life was completely academic, there would be very little growth. We could take the information that we learned in kindergarten and apply it to the problems of mature years. But we find that this is not the case. We observe that the individual, proceeding down through the years, is constantly required to face situations which he is not able to adequately meet. One of the common situations here is our inability to visualize, even abstractly, the number of possible situations that can arise in life. The old Jesuit father, Athanasius Kirchhoff, made an effort to estimate some of these incredible factors. He found that a comparatively small group of basic units, perhaps not more than 20 or 30, could be brought into so many conceivable combinations that an individual writing down these combinations at the rate of 10,000 a minute could not live long enough to write them all down. In other words, a comparatively small group of basic situations can result in combinations extending into the billions of billions. This means that in our experience, no two situations will ever be exactly alike. And none of them will ever be exactly alike the example in the textbook. This can be taken for granted. I remember a young doctor who had recently hung out his shingle, and one of his earliest problems was an acute appendicitis. He thought back very, very carefully to his experience in dissection. He also brought out all the books and the charts to make sure that he knew where everything was when he got started. As the operation proceeded, his confusion grew. The appendix was not where it was supposed to be. He discussed it later with another doctor, and the doctor smilingly said, "Think nothing of it. It never is. Whatever you may expect, that it will not be." So the individual, having learned certain broad expectations, finds that from the moment he begins to live, he must apply a certain measure of individual ingenuity to the situations that arise. They are not going to be academic. They are not going to be the probable and the expected. In every combination of factors, there is something that seems to make that combination uniquely difficult. To face this unique difficulty, the person must therefore add to his general knowledge a certain resourcefulness. He must be prepared for emergencies. He must adjust to them. And he must have certain imagination, a power to experience the possibilities of things and be prepared for them. Thus, growing has something to do with the enlarging of the area of the known patterns into which circumstances conform themselves as a result of constant contact with those patterns. This means further that through each experience that occurs, the individual adds something to his basic fund of knowledge. This fund, therefore, grows constantly unless the person closes his mind to growth. Assuming that he is a normal individual, he finds that this increasing fund of knowledge provides him with greater securities. He is less likely to be surprised. He is less likely to be bewildered. His expectations have no longer the very close patterns which come from theoretical knowledge. As he goes along, therefore, he experiences a greater resourcefulness. He experiences greater assurance. And as the skilled surgeon, after many surgical experiences, gains a certain facility to handle emergencies, he senses and knows what to do because he has been faced with numerous situations before. And out of his growing experience patterns, he is able to come to more immediately useful conclusions about situations wherein he may be not entirely adequate or informed. So this process of growth for us is simply the heaping up of greater resources in ourselves. And as these resources increase, we observe a more satisfactory personal relationship with life. Now, in the grand days years ago of popular metaphysics, we had terms which were rather delightful and naive, and many people took them quite seriously. An individual who seemed to be especially well integrated, or extremely learned, or profoundly experienced, was referred to as an old soul. This individual had been on the road a long time. He had passed through many different situations. He had become adapted and adjusted to the emergencies of existence. Another person who appeared to be what we now term a perpetual adolescent was referred to in those gay days as a young soul, one just starting out. Why one was older than another was not exactly explained, but it was assumed that perhaps down through time or eternity, what we call the old soul had been especially diligent in learning, whereas the so-called young soul might have started out at the same time, simply played hooky too often from school, did not gain the necessary experiences, or had slight aptitude for learning. Thus, the idea of the old soul was simply one that appeared to be patriarchal in achievement, to have a fuller and richer kind of life. Now, there's no doubt in the world that people are born with different degrees of insight and different degrees of resolution. It seems that some from the beginning have an aptitude for knowledge of some kind. Others appear to be deficient in this aptitude. Some are naturally thoughtful. Others appear to be born thoughtless and never seem to recover. But all, in one way or another, have to grow. They grow because either thoughtfulness or thoughtlessness will ultimately result in situations that force growth. To us, then, the idea of growth is this constantly unfolding capacity to solve problems. Now, that would be something we would all like to have in large measure at the present time, because there has never been a day that we know of when problems were as numerous or the needs for true knowledge more immediate and acute. So we turn into ourselves to search for whatever it is that is the source of this growth factor in our consciousness. And we find that this factor, like nearly all of the other elements of our problem, lies within this chemistry of sensory and mental processes. What we call growth is the gradual organization of the faculties, powers, perceptions, reflections, which make up the equipment of the person. He is growing because he is taking more in and understanding it better. There seems to be no question as to this. Growth, as it applies to our conditions in this world, must, to a measure at least, depend upon our ability to interpret and understand this world. We may assume that we have another life entirely apart from mortality, but our existence in the material universe and our adjustment to its problems seem to require that we become increasingly aware of the laws, patterns, purposes, plans, and processes that operate here. The only way that we can really become aware of our relationship to environment is to become more familiar with the laws governing environment itself. What we term growth in this case is adjustment. It is the individual becoming sufficiently equipped to lead a serene existence in the material sphere. To gain this serenity, he must begin to study this mortal existence, how it is organized, how it functions, what contributes to problem and what contributes to the solution of problem. To most persons, this knowledge is not sought voluntarily, at least in many instances. It is a byproduct. It is the byproduct of the simple process of living itself. The individual learns by doing. This is a kind of an apprenticeship system. and our material existence seems to be an apprenticeship. We learn by observing the actions of others. We learn by experiencing the results of our own actions. And, of course, to a measure, we learn from the long traditional patterns of the activity of our social group. All these things become elements in growth or in development. The beginning of growth, as the Greek philosophers pointed out, is therefore a keen sense of value. The individual must be able to perceive. He must be able to gain reports through the sensory perceptions about occurrences. And these reports must be a little more important, a little more real, a little more clear than in the case of the average person. One of the ways, of course, to make the testimony of the senses more valuable is to give greater personal attention to these testimonies. Things that go in one ear and out the other do not contribute too much to our conscious life, although they may be subconsciously recorded. The individual, to get the most out of the experiences, must focus attention upon experiences. They must be things important in themselves. He must have a tendency to weigh and examine and estimate the results of his own conduct. If he is indifferent to his own conduct, if he is unable to perceive any patterns between his actions and their consequences, he is not gaining very much in the form of experience. Experience is not just what happens. Experience is the ability of the individual to interpret what happens. If his interpretation is wrong, the experience does not contribute to his growth directly. Ultimately, however, his mistake will become the basis of a further experience in which the mistake must be corrected. But a person who is prejudiced, highly opinionated, fanatical, or bigoted will not correctly interpret experience. So an immoderate attitude on the one hand and a lack of interest on the other will both reduce the importance of the experience factor. Experience must be accepted with an open mind and must be subjected to the best processes of thought which we are capable of bringing to bear upon it. An experience, therefore, is an open invitation to growth. But this invitation is not forced upon us. We can ignore the experience, we can repeat the mistakes, we can evade the responsibility for our own actions, and thus we can slow down this thing that we call growth. If we are really here to grow, and most philosophies assume that we are, then, of course, it is important for us to make the most of every opportunity to grow. And we can perhaps find some parallels for these circumstances in other departments of life. A non-artist, looking at a scene in the forest or on the side of a hill, will observe the same general physical forms that an artist will see. The artist, however, if he is going to paint this picture, must have an acute sense of proportion and color. An artist painting a tree will not paint it exactly as a non-artist will see that tree. If you ask the non-artist what color the tree is, he will say it is brown. At least the trunk is brown. But when the artist paints that brown trunk, he may use from 5 to 15 different colors to get that brown. He may paint what looks to us to be a plain gray shadow, but when he paints it, it may be green, violet, it may be brown, it may have deep reds in it, it may have many, many colors that to the untrained eye are not perceived. Yet if the artist is skillful, and he finally completes his painting, and frames it and hangs it on the wall, and the non-artist looks at it, the non-artist will see the tree as he himself saw it. But he will not realize that it required a very deep understanding of color to produce, by means of paint, the very simple shades which appeared to be in the structure of the tree. The artist had a specialized color sense, and he realized how many colors it took to make a tree look brown. Now, in this way, a philosopher or a mystic, looking at life, sees much more than the person who is thoughtless or indifferent or unskilled or ungifted in these areas. As we become more thoughtful, however, and we are sincerely concerned with the processes of self-improvement, we naturally become more attentive to details, also to masses. We begin to study the elements which make up patterns. These are no longer simply colors as we know them on a painter's palette. Lord Bacon called these moral colors the colors of good and evil. And there is a beautiful sense of value there. The discovery of the infinite tonalities of incidents. How we are to take these comparatively simple situations and actually find their meaning. Or if the situations appear to be hopelessly complicated, how we can gradually reduce them to their essential elements. Thus it is true that there will always be in the world some who, looking at the tree, will see nothing of interest. And there will also be a few who, looking at the same tree, will discover it to be a wonder of creation. The attitude has much to do with it. Now, where does the attitude come from? Why are some persons apparently born thoughtful and others born thoughtless? The answer has to be that the individual brings forward into present activities the substance and essence of previous attainment. We are not starting. We are not individuals beginning at this time with a new and complete nature. We are all somewhere midstream in the great process of evolution. And while it is true that the differences in various persons may seem very great, actually these differences are not as tremendous as might first appear. They are differences within a comparatively small pattern of possibilities. But these differences seem to be large, and in the course of life seem to produce very large and often conflicting results. In the general study of mysticism, and I think in a sense are thinking about the Buddhist machine of the sensory perceptions, we do gradually come to realize that the highest testimony of these perceptions will be the ability to perceive the depth of value in things. Perhaps we can say it in another way, that the end of the perceptive process is that we shall see all of a matter. That the perceptions will reveal to us everything that it is possible for them to confer. That all these perceptions, acting completely as far as their own natures are concerned, will each of them produce a maximum of testimony, and will allow this testimony to move in to the central coordinating power. If all of the sensory perceptions are fully developed so that everything which they can know or can discover is conveyed, the coordinator then has the fullest possible means of estimating the situation under consideration. If all the testimonies of the senses unite, as in the case or example given by Immanuel Kant, in the description of an apple, if all of these sensory testimonies convey their own fullest support in the consideration of the object, the ultimate will be that the coordinator will have a full and complete concept of an apple. Each one of the faculties will have contributed a supporting or sustaining testimony. One by one, they remove doubts left by the deficiencies of each other, until in the end, no doubt remains. This is an apple. Now, the great problem that these faculties are all afflicted by is that they are sensitive and subject to a kind of hallucination. Studies in suggestion therapy indicate the area of difficulty. The faculties can be conditioned away from normalcy. Faculties can be taught not to function, or they can be taught to function by a very special kind of training, so that this function is no longer normal, accurate, or true. Also, the testimonies which they bring in, like the evidence of witnesses in a court trial, these testimonies, this evidence, if it is placed in the hands of a corrupted judge, will not result in an honest verdict. If the mental coordinator is corrupted, if the coordinator is unable to function as it should, the testimonies of the sensory perceptions are distorted and deformed, and the verdict arrived at in the mind will not be right. An example of this, of course, is the problem of style and of various passing moods of tradition and schools of thought. For example, some years ago, certain impressionistic artists produced some rather strange and mysterious productions. To most people, these productions were meaningless. Some were extremely distasteful. Still others really hurt the person who tried to look at them. And a little trip through the Museum of Modern Art in New York can be a pretty soul-disturbing adventure. But after 12, 20, 30, 40 years of the modern art trend, we found people beginning to ask each other such questions as, is it good? Or am I wrong? This person says it's wonderful. That critic says it's the noblest job that was ever done. Certain person has just bought this picture for $75,000. I don't like it. Am I crazy? Is the man who bought it crazy? What is wrong with what? Or who? And gradually, out of familiarity, out of constant indoctrination in this way, persons who really do not like modern art convince themselves or are convinced by others that it is good and it is important. And first thing you know, we find one of these strange pictures hanging on the wall of one of their rooms. they still do not know what is good about it. They still subconsciously do not like it, but they feel that they should. After all, everyone cannot be wrong. Now, we have the same thing in religious bigotry. If we belong to a group of people in which perhaps we know that there are millions who hold the same extremely traditional points of view, that are just as conservative as they want us to be, and yet we feel that these ideas are too small, we are gradually subjected to indoctrination. In time, we may become just as narrow-minded as the person whom we might resent, simply because in due course we have sold ourselves an attitude which destroys for us the validity of our own experience. In a more personal way, an individual will develop gradually a habit of being sorry for themselves. Self-pity is a very pitiable condition, yet many people develop it. After a time of being sorry for ourselves, we establish a habit pattern. And in the due course, practically every testimony that comes in to our sensory structure is distorted or in some way exaggerated so that it will appear to contribute to our own misery. In this way, we can continue to become more and more sorry for ourselves. Experience finally ends as nothing but the final justification that we have been picked out of the universe to be made miserable. Every other factor is lost. Nothing is recorded but that which supports the intensity of our own viewpoint. Now, no one is completely clear of viewpoint. Some have it in larger doses than others. But we all have certain attitudes, certain convictions, certain beliefs that to us are just frightfully important. We cannot conceive of any fact being in conflict with what we want to believe. So we proceed to eliminate the fact rather than change ourselves. When these types of attitudes become fixed in our natures, we cease to grow. Growth is blocked, therefore, by any attitude which destroys the free circulation of facts in our own consciousness. The individual who is no longer able to look at a fact and say, I was wrong. A person who cannot do this is cutting off his own experience benefits very definitely. Experience always must lead us, finally, to the correction of our own conduct into conformity with the reality of the matter under analysis or thought. The moment we try to force the fact to change, we are in trouble. Facts will not change, but we can imagine that they do, and can go on for a long time deluding ourselves in these particulars. But wherever delusion comes in, the facts become less available. It is as though the light of reason was obscured by a heavy fog, the fog of our own opinions. In the problem of yoga, or in the mystical disciplines of the Near East and ancient times, one of the ways to grow was to clear the channels by means of which man is aware of life. As long as these channels are blocked or obscured by false attitudes, the person cannot grow graciously. He makes so many mistakes that nature becomes an instrument of retribution for that person. Nature seems to turn on him and hurt him. Nature hasn't turned at all. The individual has only gotten into such a bad relationship with nature that he is hurting himself. In the machinery of cognition, Anything which destroys the smooth running of the machine is bad. I remember in the old days when we had bookkeepers and accountants who didn't have computers and things of that nature, and had to work it out almost entirely with their own basic knowledge of mathematics. Many of them did not even have an adding machine. And in the old days, when the adding machine was first introduced, those who had not been trained to use it considered it a very unpleasant device and continued to do it in the old way. But there was a terrible catastrophe when the bookkeeper, having about 40 or 50 different number patterns in his mind, and just getting them drawn together, was interrupted by someone talking to him. The entire pattern that he had added up sort of dissipated instantly, and he had to start all over again. In other words, he was interrupted, his mind was turned away from the sum that he was gradually adding together, and if this happened too often, the poor old man frequently got a little irritated about the whole thing. The same process takes place within our own thinking. If we are building up a beautiful pattern of consistent and related subjects and matters, if we are gradually getting at the facts of a case, and then a prejudice flashes into the situation, or the individual suddenly turns against fact by some subconscious process in himself, the whole structure falls apart. All of the validity of the gradually forming pattern is broken up, and the mind has to start again to put the pieces together. To meet this, our ancient brethren always insisted that the only way to gain the greatest amount of experience is to reduce the personal equation in the use and estimation of experience. The personal equation is always one that is very highly tinctured by personal desire and personal advantage. Where this becomes too strong, facts will never be known. So to gradually reduce the pressures of artificial elements over-influencing or interfering with the natural arrival of the mind at its conclusions, these interferences and obstacles have to be gradually eliminated. This was the reason why the meditational processes were set up. They were intended to reveal to the person the possibility of being unconditioned in his own nature in the acceptance of facts. If he could be neutral as far as the fact was concerned, he could then receive the honest report of his own coordinating faculties. If he could get this honest report distorted in no way whatsoever, then he was in the position to use the greatest degree of fact in the solution of some problem of his own. If he had these facts and had them clearly set in his own mind, he could then make decisions which were useful, which advanced his condition, and which contributed to what we call his growth. So the growth of reason in the individual was simply the unfoldment of the power to be reasonable in all things. To be reasonable means to avoid exaggeration. It means also not to overlook small things because of the pressure of masses. It meant very definitely not to overlook virtues in other people because we do know that they have vices. It means not to overlook the importance of ideas because those ideas do not mean too much to us at the moment. It is this process of getting greater thoroughness into all of the procedures of life. What is it then that is adding all this up? What is the instrument by means of which the record of the unfoldment of our faculties is preserved. Buddha would say that it is this sattva, or the self. It is this thing which, though not an essential reality, is a continuing, functioning force, or power, or vortex of energy over a very long period of time. The sattva, or self, the ego, is nothing but the immediate substance of the known and the unknown. It is the mysterious compound of what we do understand and what we do not understand. Thus, whatever part of the thing we understand has a certain luminous quality. The parts that we do not understand are dark and mysterious. And this luminosity and this darkness make the lights and shadows, or contrasts, in our thinking. Wherever we are aware, wherever we know the true shapes of things appear, where we do not know, imaginary forms seem to fill in the mysterious gray intervals. The child, who is a little afraid of the hole in the dark, may be frightened at the thought of entering a dark closet. They may conceive this closet to be the opening of a great pit leading into mystery, madness, and death. And small children are frequently afraid of these holes in the dark. Yet we all have these. For wherever there are areas within ourselves of the unknown, they are the areas of mystery. And mystery is closely related to misery. Wherever this darkness has no definition that we can truly see, we are going to imagine definitions. We are going to always populate darkness with danger. We are going to be afraid of it. We are going to be prejudiced against it. And we simply cannot realize or believe that darkness is simply an area of the commonplace upon which the light of fact has not yet been cast. But with light and shadow forever mingling in our activity, the sattva, or the self, is the strange blending of hope, which is of light, fear, which is of darkness, good, which is of light, evil, which is of darkness. Always there will be the danger that we will need some form of knowledge that is not available because it is still in a dark area. The egotist doesn't believe in dark areas. He believes that whatever he does see is all light. And because he is overconvinced of his own knowledge, he falls easily prey to his ignorance. He is therefore the easiest of all persons to deceive and exploit. Actually, the personality, the ego, is this mysterious alchemical mixture of the known and the unknown. And whatever elements are composing this, each of these elements also has its known and its unknown factors. Even to the greatest mathematician, there are facts of mathematics still dark. Even to the merest child beginning to reach out into the mystery of material existence, there are still small areas of light. Nothing is completely light, nothing completely dark. No science has exhausted all its mystery. No art has perfected all its works. In everything, there is a light in the midst of darkness. There are the areas of the known against the vast areas of the unknown. And in man's experience, that which he has experienced is light. That which he has not experienced is darkness. And his ego is composed of the fusion of these two. this strange marbleized pattern of light and dark, this wonderful mosaic of alternate colored stones. And everywhere, at every time in life, the decisions that we make, the attitudes that we hold, the conclusions that we reach, are in perfect conformity to these areas of light and darkness within ourselves. Where there is darkness within ourselves, there can be no certainty in our decision. Where there is light within ourselves, there is a measure of certainty. But in experience itself, we realize that all certainties finally vanish again into uncertainties, and that no matter how much man knows, he is forever surrounded by a sea or area of the unknown, which is vaster than any possible achievement or attainment which man himself can hope to achieve. Yet by the very circumstance of nature, man is not required to have light beyond those problems with which he is concerned. He is not expected to function in a universe for which he has no faculties of adjustment. Thus, for him, light and darkness are comparatively simple factors. Factors in which light more or less tells how far we have come, and darkness warns of how far we have yet to go. We will always ultimately come to the point where darkness sets in. Here we must either admit ignorance or try to bluff. Or we must deny our own ignorance and try to force an opinion or some form of a concept upon others concerning that which we do not know. Now, the light runs out in a number of directions. One of the directions in which one of our deepest problems lies is that the area of the unknown for most persons involves the inner lives of other people. We have the greatest amount of light on surfaces. We have a considerable amount of physical light on physical surfaces. We look out as we drive our car, we see the roads, we see the trees, we see the people. There doesn't seem to be any lack of light. But the moment we leave surfaces, either to ascend or descend from the obvious, we begin to come into a twilight region, and from that pass finally to utter darkness. When we try to understand other people, we realize that what we call understanding them is nothing more than bestowing our own attributes upon these other people. We interpret them only in terms of ourselves. They interpret us only in terms of their own natures. So as far as the facts are concerned, the inside, the inner part of everything is dark. Sometimes it's a little darker than at other times, but there is always a gray shadow there somewhere. The inside of ourselves is dark. We have no real ability to declare with absolute certainty the experience of our own inner life. We live upon a surface, and onto this surface seems to float upward a great deal of subjective material, but we do not know just where it comes from or how it reaches the surface. The depths of ourselves, the depths of other things are strangely dark. The difference between a light area and a dark area for man is also one other thing. In light areas, we have light because we have experienced. Perhaps not now, but sometime. Always where there is light, it means that whatever that light pertains to, we have done. We have actually achieved a distinct victory wherever light seems to cast itself upon other things. If we see a thing correctly, it is because we have truly experienced the fact of that thing. Darkness is always an area of non-experienced existence. It means that in that particular area we can only depend upon the opinions of others, hearsay, belief, tradition, or at best, second-hand experience transmitted from others. The second-hand experience may cause a certain pre-dawn to break a little. We may see a little gray shadow where the darkness was before, and it looks as though a little light was there. But until we have actually experienced it ourselves, there can be no true light. For this light cannot be reflected from the consciousness of other people. Each person, in his search for light, must light the outside from the inside. There is no escape from this absolute necessity. To grow is then to be able to increase the areas of light. To grow is to gradually take the shadows away from dark areas. And as we take the shadows away, the facts of those areas, now lighted, become available for use. The more of these lighted areas exist, the more certainties we have. Let us take an anthropological point of view for a moment. Our remote ancestors had mostly darkness and very little light. They feared everything. They feared physical darkness. They feared a clump of trees a few hundred feet from the cave where they lived. They feared every animal, every creature. They feared the sky and the winds and the lightning and the thunder. And they bestowed upon practically every energy of nature the power to hurt them. These persons were therefore forced to exist in a vast world of fears. For wherever there is no light, there is much fear. Down through time, this very process of growing has gradually reduced these fear factors. We no longer regard the thunders as the voices of angry gods. We no longer think of lightning as something aimed at us because we have broken some taboo or have failed to make proper offerings on the altars of demons. We no longer regard everything around us as fearful. Little by little, we have come to understand some of the elements of our own existence. Wherever we have understood, light has come, and on this understanding we have built progress. And this progress is a collective form of growth. But where from the beginning to now the dark areas have never been cleared, in these areas we still have primordial fears. We still find that when we let down the surface courage arising from mutual support, we do experience some of the old atavistic terrors that burdened our forebears. Many people are still intensely superstitious. Many are still convinced of the presence of great evil forces moving behind the mistakes of mankind. We haven't yet learned that these evils are really a combination of darkness and our own inability to find the light of solution to problems. Thus, the whole situation at any moment in our lives is that we have certain availabilities and certain lack of availability. And if this was clear to us at every moment, it would be very wonderful. If we could see all the things we really think we know with little rings of light around them, and all the little things that we don't think we know with little rings of darkness around them, so the mind could say, this I know and this I do not know, it is obvious, it would be quite simple. By now we would have been out conquering practically every weakness of our own natures.
If even a little bell rang when things were wrong, it would cause a great deal of happiness for all concerned and also an awful lot of bell ringing. But at the same time, it would be useful. But here is our difficulty. Wherever there is a hole in our insight, wherever knowledge ceases, wherever the light of our experience fails, the dark part is invisible. The dark part is not something that you can measure in the same way that you seem to be able to measure light. When you say an individual is rather brilliant, that he has a marvelous ability to meet situations, you're talking about the light side of him. But when you ask someone, what is it that this person does not know? That's very hard to answer. You have a suspicion, it's a long list, but you don't know where it begins or how. When you say to yourself, where do my own certainties end and my own uncertainties begin? This takes a great deal of thought, because the certainties and the notions and the opinions form such a surfacing that we are not aware of the vacant areas in our own insight. They simply do not testify at all, so we do not know they exist. The only way we find out they exist is when we make a very stupid blunder of some kind and wonder how we did it. How could we have missed this entire area of probabilities? It is only under such a condition as that we suddenly become aware of these blind spots in our reason. Otherwise, it just looks as though the light is always there and always abundant, so we keep on living by the light part and allowing the dark part to pass unnoticed. But there's too much dark there. We cannot actually make an adequate adjustment. We cannot be in the presence of so much that we do not know and still at the same time make a good job of living. One way in which we can, of course, come to some conclusions about this subject, at least academically, is to try to list the things that we know, the things that we do not know. It would be quite obvious that the average man probably does not know how to bake a good cake. He has never tried. On the other hand, some of the greatest bakers that have ever lived have been men, so that the problem doesn't present any insurmountable obstacle. But a person will say with some frankness, I don't know how to do this. I've never done it. Now, this is fine as far as it goes, but do we carry this sense of honesty deeply enough? Do we look at a person and say, I do not know how to judge you? Usually we do not. Usually we depend on the light part of our understanding, ignore the dark part, and come to a prejudiced opinion. So this dark area is always a potential area of prejudice. It is always an area in which our opinions, our attitudes, our beliefs are not valuable. And most people cannot live with the idea that they have any ideas, attitudes, or beliefs that are not valuable. We assume that they are all right. And we try to force ourselves beyond the point where our abilities actually will sustain true progress. The answer always is not that you can overcome all this ignorance immediately. No one can. There are many things to be known in this world that man will not be able to know for a very long time. But there is a wonderful strength not only in knowing what you know, but also in knowing that you do not know. This brings with it a certain caution. This causes us to reconsider and to perhaps try a little harder to arrive at a better conclusion. If we are perfectly willing to withhold finality of judgment, perhaps the Scripture was very wise when it pointed out that vengeance belongs to the Lord, and that God will repay, because God alone, apparently, or the principle of universal consciousness which we associate with God, is, at least theoretically, the only consciousness that knows everything. Man does not. Man's knowledge is in the constant process of enlargement, and this enlargement is his growth. Growth must begin by the recognition of what we know, where we are in knowledge, and also the full recognition of that which we do not know. And because the fact that we do not know is the larger equation in most instances, we have to proceed rather cautiously. Knowledge must be extended from foundations established in consciousness. We cannot plunge into some vast abstraction far from the shores of certainty. What we must do in each case is extend the known, carefully, methodically, thoughtfully, to its next areas of probability. We must light near to where light already is. We cannot flash this light into the midst of the darkness and expect to have it very solutional. Growth, then, is a gradual encroachment upon darkness. It is a little more and more of light extending cautiously, carefully, wisely into the unknown. The person can constantly build upon what he already possesses. And as he continues to build, the structure of his consciousness enlarges. The structure of his insight enlarges. And gradually, knowledge leads to experience, which brings further light. Light is always the experience factor. Light is the thing known certainly by having actually experienced that thing. To begin the cycle of growth, then, is to become aware that the so-called ego, or self, is itself in the process of becoming. It is not something that is complete. The ego cannot turn to us the current of universal knowledge. We cannot dig deeply enough into the ego to get any more out of it than is in there. This is a mistake people have had the tendency to make. They have assumed that because something is inside of us, this must be infallible. It is not. The judgments of the ego can never be greater than the experiences which are stored in the coordinator, or this force, the factor, which brings all experience to bear upon new experience, or brings experience to bear upon the challenge for the need of experience. So there's no use hunting inside the personality for infallibles. They will not be found there. The best that is going to come out is the best that is in there. Now, there's much more in there than there used to be. That is why, in spite of our mistakes and in spite of our neglects, man is growing. He is growing because little by little the content of the experienced part of knowledge is constantly growing, but slowly. Not nearly as rapidly as we wish it would grow. There is also another very tricky factor which you seldom hear discussed and which does not usually obtrude itself into this problem. Namely, that as man is learning by experience to adjust to certain situations, the processes of history are making these situations themselves extinct. The individual may have passed through a great deal of experience in the Roman Empire. Let's imagine that consciousness learned certain things in the Roman Empire, or in one of 100 previous embodiments. This would be much more helpful if we still had a Roman Empire. But unfortunately, we do not. So experience divides itself very clearly into two levels. Experience which is only useful in a condition which itself is highly time-bound. The experiences that we may have passed through during the Crusades or during the medieval period in history will not necessarily be sufficient to equip us for the problems of today. Just as the young man today graduating from school could not go back 10 years from now and take the same examination and pass. He could not do it. Not because he is not thoughtful, but because the whole system of instruction will have changed, and he will not be able to adapt himself to it without taking the entire course over again. Very few graduates could graduate a second time 5 years later. This means that there is an experience pattern that is extremely immediate. This is very largely the experience of particulars. The problem as to whether we should eat with our fingers or knives and forks is a very transitory problem. Also, the skill we may learn in driving an automobile may be of no use to us, except for the particular embodiment in which we now find ourselves. But behind and below this level of passing experience patterns, there is another which reminds us of the fact that essential elements do not change very rapidly. For example, the person learning to drive a car conscientiously, intelligently, honorably, and with due consideration for the rights of others may never drive a car again after he gets through with this life. But his due consideration and his conscientiousness and his thoughtfulness and his prudence will be useful forever. Thus, we cannot tie these achievements entirely to an incident or to a level. For true growth is always a growth of principles. And this is why so much of modern education is wasted. Because unless principles are given, the individual learns things which have no permanent utility. The person who learns to keep the police code may be a criminal himself 2 years from now because the code will change. But the individual who recognizes the basic rights of man around which all codes are built will be honorable under the Roman Empire or under any other system that ever comes into existence. If his own integrity is right, he is growing. And in this process of growing, he is building a character which will serve him better wherever he is as a person. The real reason behind growth is always the maturing of the power of the individual to keep the rules of existence. Now, among the most shadowy areas of our personality, all those areas, there is that general area which has to do with principles. We have great difficulty in understanding the more abstract phases of universal law. Certain laws we can see and work with. We recognize the law of gravity. We recognize that water has a tendency to flow downhill and things of this nature. But when it comes to the moral laws of life, we're not sure of them at all. And when it comes to the great question of what the universe expects and demands of us, there is really very little uniformity of opinion. These great areas of principles, what is truth, what is beauty, what is love, these great thoughts generally catch us in dark areas. We do not know how to cope with them. When we think of love, we can only think of human affection. It is very difficult for us to conceive of a universal affection. When we think of beauty, we think of it in terms of what we like now. We have no real understanding of its deeper significance. We are subject, therefore, to shifting standards in all these things. When we ask ourselves, what does the universe want me to do next? We are in an area where there is not too much light generally available. A little, perhaps, a little more than we admit sometimes, because we're not always very anxious to do what the universe wants to be done next. It may interfere with what we want to do next. But if it does interfere, and we permit our own purposes to overshadow universal purposes, we're not going to grow directly. We're going to grow the hard way, through having broken faith with the rules of the game. But let's say for the moment that we really want to grow, and we want to do what is next. We want to do what is best for all concerned. We would like not to evade anything. We would like to head into that experience which will most enrich us and will most help us to grow. All philosophy agrees that to make this decision, the first requirement is that we become impersonal. We cannot serve God and Caesar successfully at the same time. Caesar, in this case, being ourselves. We cannot do exactly what we want to do and still be uniquely attentive to the universal plan of things. We're not that far advanced that our own desires will always conform with universal good. This is too much to ask. So the decision must be that before we can decide what is good, we must be willing to accept the decision and do that which is indicated. We must be perfectly willing to put this good above our own personal feelings. This is a conflict. It is always a conflict, and is the reason why all over this world today there are people who have beautiful ideas but are not doing very well with them, actually, in practice. But if we really want to grow, and grow as rapidly and effectively as possible, this strange sense of the impersonality of right must be experienced within us. We must say to ourselves truly that the universal will must be done. What is it that the deepest part of my insight concerning existence tells me is the next thing to do? The final end of experience is in itself that it always does point the way to the next thing. But it does not point the way to things 10 or 15 steps removed. Experience almost always tells us why we are right or why we are wrong. But we are not too attentive. So we can say that if the person will place that which is right and that which is necessary and that which is good above his own personal desires, he has a very good chance of being able to estimate the next thing for himself. In a broad, general manner, one thing we can nearly always point out as a formula. Not always, but it is an overwhelmingly common formula. And that is, if it's hard and you don't like it, it's next. Now, this is practically Scripture. If it is the thing you say, Lord, deliver me from, that is probably what you should be working on. If it is next to impossible, it is next. Most folks would rather do the things which are easy. This means they would rather repeat previous experience. if they've gotten so good at it for the last 50,000 years that it just practically is automatic, then they're willing to make a supreme effort and do exactly what they intended to. But if it's difficult, if it means that the person has to make some unique and rather unpleasant effort, in the general thought that all effort is unpleasant, if the person finds that it is not the thing that a lazy man can do, if it is not a continuance of the existing pattern, then probably it is high time to do something about it. Another good rule is, if something is hurting you, your next problem is to find out why. This process of going on, being hurt forever, and simply suffering is not nature's plan. If you are sitting on a hot stove, do not assume for a moment that the infinite requires you to stay there. But it may take a certain amount of energy to jump off the stove. But certainly at that moment, that jump is next. In each instance, the immediate problem is nearly always the challenge. The immediate problem is the thing that must be now faced. And we must gather up all our resources to face it. For the moment we face it, it ceases to be a problem. A problem solved ceases. A problem unsolved comes back and nags us through ages, if necessary. No problem unsolved will ever really disappear. No problem unsolved can be completely left behind. We may push it to one side, we may put it off for the moment, but if it's there, it will come home to us in the end. This process of pushing it off and having it hit back, the process of tossing it to one side and having it bounce back and hit us again, means that the longer we procrastinate a solution, the more we will suffer from the problem. So the growth is the sense or the concept of moving into the problem now. To move into it, not with regret, not with pious sense of martyrdom, not with a deep, soul-shaking sigh. The problem is to move in on it, solve it, and watch it dissolve. Once we move in upon the problem, experience the power to solve that problem, we have achieved a step of growth. Now, the problems that beset most of us most intimately are of three general kinds. The first is dispositional. We all have faults. We all have plenty of them. But all our faults do not come into focus at any one time. This is lucky. But there is nearly always one fault in focus at almost any time. We discover that in some one way we are at this moment our own worst enemy. This is the one we have to work on now. When that is gone, do not be lonely. There'll be another come along. But it will be different, and there is a certain delight in variety. But this problem will not go until it is faced. Nearly everyone knows that they have character problems. They can even name them. But if you look into your environment, your business, your home, your social life, your relationship with yourself, your ability to live with other people or work with other people, you will find that there is one besetting situation at this moment that could be improved. That things are not as smooth as they could be, and the reason is somewhere in you. You can say you're tired. You can say you're nervous. You're saying you don't know any better. You're saying that other people just simply prod you along until you can't stand it any longer. But the problem is there, and the problem must be solved. The only way that it can cease to be a problem is to be outgrown. The second type of problem, which nearly everyone faces in the course of their daily life, is adjustment to situations around them. Here we have the individual in the presence of something that he feels he cannot change. Other people will not do what he wants or what he expects them to do or what he believes they should do, but they have the monotonous habit of being there anyway, making things more complicated for this individual. The answer here is now a matter of adjustment relationship. If the situation is essentially bad, then it may require courage to break the situation, to admit that it is wrong, and to admit that we're staying in it because of some weakness or some instinct to compromise or dishonesty or some selfishness or some status symbolism. And we are not willing to admit the fact that the pattern itself is bad. Perhaps nature's next lesson in experience is the individual giving up what he wants in order to attain peace of mind without which he cannot survive. This is a decision. If he decides wrongly, nature continues to penalize him. He has to finally decide whether he is going to sacrifice the lesser for the greater or vice versa. So here is an immediate area of problem in the life and condition of the person in his relationships with other people. The third area in which a problem perhaps presents itself lies in the matter of gaining new skills. There is nothing an individual dislikes more than the thought of going back to school after he's graduated. But many persons want to achieve good things, have serious and sincere desire to attain, have the instinct to be able to use what is attained, but they are still impotent as far as their ability to do these things is concerned. So we have the individual who has high motives and no training. We have the person who would gladly give his life, but at the present condition his life isn't worth much. He has very little to give, which is a terribly frustrating thing and a very painful thing. A few break through this by tremendous resolution, but the majority are completely defeated by it. The moment we realize that what we know is not enough to meet the demands of our own ideals, our own principles, and our own convictions, then we have to learn more, regardless of what it costs. We have to give up pleasures to achieve these necessities which become the basis of more enduring pleasures in the future. So wherever a person is well-intentioned but helpless, he must in some way correct this by gaining the abilities to do the things that he wants to do and which he realizes need to be done. So wherever we can't solve a problem because we simply do not know enough, then in one way or another we must seek to know more. Now the search to know more is a fascinating adventure in itself. But the desire for knowledge, apart from the proper use of knowledge, is itself a blind alley. The individual does not grow from what he knows alone. He grows from what he does with what he knows. For it is always the action that provides the experience which provides the light which is growth. So wherever we have any of these barriers between ourselves and advancement, we must either relinquish the idea of advancement or else we must overcome the barriers. nature presses us to overcome barriers. It does this by constantly confronting us with small, nagging situations which we cannot quite handle, but sometimes feel that we ought to be able to. If we reject these small, nagging invitations long enough, they heap up into large matters, and we suddenly come headlong into a great monument of neglect or evasion, which seems pretty formidable, and which can hurt us very desperately when we try to break through this kind of a barrier. So always try to get rid of the small things, one at a time as they come up. Because if you can do this, they will not make the large things. And each small thing conquered and experienced becomes a new light upon other things. It's very interesting that every drop of experienced consciousness that we have enriches the whole of our total egoic insight. As we get further and further into the true mysteries of light, as we recognize them in the ego itself, we come finally to realize that the end of growth is a mysterious condition of universal light. Now, the moment light is universal, the moment light is not separated by objects. For example, we can imagine that you stand a vase or a cup or a bowl on a table and you light it as you would if you were an artist going to draw a picture of this. The bowl stands out because of contrast. One area is lighted and the other area is not lighted. This results in modeling. It gives the picture its highlights and its shadows, and because of highlights and shadows, the picture exists. If there was nothing but highlight, there would be nothing on the paper, whatever, except light. Thus, if we go on experiencing and increasing light and continually contribute to the decrease of shadow, we pass finally into the condition of consciousness in which there is no shadow. And this means, actually, that we have outgrown the entire concept of good and evil, of light and darkness. And the entity or the egoic nature itself becomes simply the center of a universal experience, so far as this experience is possible to us here. Nothing remains as a detail. Nothing can challenge, because the experience has absorbed all of that which is not known. In the experience of totality, the individual completes the possible experiences of egoic existence. This is more or less the concept of samadhi. It is also found in Zen, because the total experience is strangely the end of experience. When there is nothing left to experience, the very factor of experience ceases, because it can only live by conquering the unknown. When there is no longer any unknown, strangely enough, the value of both the known and the unknown cease. It's a very peculiar thing, but if you think it through carefully, you can get the idea in this sense, that man would never know that he was wise unless there were areas of ignorance in himself. He would never know that he is wiser than anyone else or less wise unless there were other people with whom he could compare himself. He can never tell how far along he is on the road if there are no road markers. And he can never tell how much truth he possesses unless he is able to contrast it to the absence of itself. If it should occur, therefore, that the individual achieves the total experience of the total use of all of his faculties and powers for the total purpose for which they were intended, you do not have a wise man, you do not have a good man, you do not have any of these qualifying terms that are meaningless without their opposites. You simply have a condition of universal adjustment. You have a thing that is completely identified with its own objects. It is subject-object in one. There is no longer any differentiation. When there is no difference between the thing experiencing and the thing experienced, you then have yoga, which is total union. In this total union, you then have the Buddhistic concept of the gradual extinction of the ego. The ego ceases, or the personality ceases, only when there is no longer any difference between our center of knowledge and the area of the knowable. When these are identical, the individual is in a state of total existence. This means that in terms of growth, that the cycle of growing as we know it has been completed. Thus, there being nothing further to challenge the consciousness does not come forward to meet challenge. If there is no advancement of consciousness to meet challenge, if man is not in the condition of rolling up his sleeves and swinging a club, if he is no longer in an unhappy relationship with anything, if he is no longer in a condition in which he has to fight in order to maintain his attitudes, because his attitudes have now become identical with fact and are no longer assailable, then all of these things, by means of which he has to know himself as something separate from other things and at war with them. When this ceases, when the individual is no longer called upon to adjust, whatever may be the inner nature of himself simply is no longer discernible. For we know ourselves only by what we do, and largely by our mistakes. What we do is only action in the terms of the conquest of the unknown in some form. We do one thing in order to survive. We do another thing in order to have housing. We do something else in order to be competitive with our neighbor. But when all of these values have been exhausted, then all of the pressures which normally come to the surface and by which we come to know ourselves as persons no longer come to the surface because they are no longer challenged. The individual then, in the terms of Buddhism, experiences the identification of himself with totality. He feels no need anymore to be a person, because he realizes that a person is only a conditioned existence, and that the thing he has been trying to outgrow from the beginning was conditioned existence. And if he ever succeeds, if he finally attains his end, then the last thing he must outgrow is his own existence. Now, it would seem as though this is a nihilistic point, that by outgrowing his own existence, he simply ceases. But this is not actually true at all, because this adjustment to the pressure of situations or conditions is only a temporary relationship at best. The ego, as the experiencing thing, cannot be the true person. It cannot be the actual reality. Because if this actual reality has an existence, it has to have a total adjustment at all times. The personality, therefore, cannot be the true being. Nor can the personality discover the nature of the true being while it is conditioned by its own need for particular experience. So the end of the situation lies in the total elimination of the personality as a mask, a persona, an instrument. And that which is left when the personality no longer rises to meet the challenge of experience and is therefore no longer to be distinguished, it cannot be invoked by circumstances, but remains or becomes absolutely quiescent, going to sleep because it is finished. In this particular moment, the entire pattern of existence has to shift from the negative to the positive. The creature which has existed only because it was wrong must finally give way to the creature that can only exist because it is right. And this is not the way we live. We are not the creature that can only exist because it is right. Therefore, this is another kind of creature. This is a kind of creature we cannot know, because our own experience is not touched by it. But somewhere at the root of existence, at the root of our existence, beyond the individual always trying to get out of trouble, there must be the being that has never been in trouble. The creature that is moving positively rather than negatively. And Buddhism takes the attitude that when we come to the final extinction of this thing which we call the personality in the process of growth, what we are actually doing is moving from a negative to a positive side of our own complete being. In other words, we are the shadow. The shadow of light is our own personal being. The light is a reality, the darkness is the personality. Wherever light and shadow mingle, light stands for the reality that never changes, and darkness for the personality which in itself can never actually experience light. It can sense light. It can experience growth, but it cannot experience the true essence of truth. As we go along then, and there is more and more light and less darkness, there is more and more universality and less personality. And the time has to come when the individual simply changes his polarization. Whatever there is beyond this is a positive growth, a growth by means of true knowing, a growth in which the individual moves toward those ends which are real, instead of constantly moving away from those ends which are not real. So in the very core of this thing, there is this switch about, in which as to the personality, by evolution, has exhausted its ignorance. That which remains is the beginning of the reality, which then positively unfolds into light. As a plant growing must first dig its roots deep where they are not seen, it seems that the individual in unfolding has to first of all put its taproot deep into the illusion of darkness. And then only after it has subjectively built its dark rootage can it then gradually raise itself into the light and come forth. There is a point in man's evolution when there is this transference, when growth, as this long, difficult process toward attainment, achieves its end and dies in the process. The entire process of man as a person ceases in the fulfillment of itself, and in its place comes the experience of man as a total divine being. And this divine being is not ignorant, is not searching ways out of pain, but is established forever in insight by its own nature, and thus becomes not an involuntary creature growing, but a voluntary being unfolding according to true insight of purpose. Therefore, the negative personality growing up ceases when error ceases. But when error ceases, reality begins. And a being that we do not know, inhabiting a region we cannot fully comprehend, then takes over. And growth becomes merely the unfoldment of the true flower in the eternal light of truth. The bodhisattva state is represented by the lotus. And this lotus opens its petals to light, without resistance, without fear, without burden, without pain. And that which has finally outgrown its humanity comes to experience the dawn of its universal or divine existence. We do not have any words for this, But we do believe that growth finally ends in the end of the need for growth, and that therefore the conditioned existence of man ends in a conditionless state, and that which has striven so hard to climb from darkness into light finds that there is no need of itself after it has completed the climb. But there is something else, something deeper, something eternal in man, which is born in that moment when the struggle against ignorance ceases. So in that very moment when the person dies, phoenix-like, the divine being is born from its ashes. This is an alchemical transmutation. And that which is truly eternal is triumphantly resurrected from all the temporal experiences of time. We cannot hope to understand this state in a conditioned existence, but we can sense within ourselves its reality. And toward the fuller experience of this transition, we hope by growth to attain the virtues necessary for the perfection of ourselves. Well, I think our time is up, so we'll have to let it go for this time, but we'll be with you again next week.